So, a bit of this is, first of all, thank you for inviting me to talk a little bit about how, mangroves' role sort of in the global carbon cycle. In particular, we're going to be focused on change. And part of this was actually knowing that Andre was going to be here. I know he was going to talk a lot about the carbon. I'm going to be really talking about how we define how that mangrove ecosystem actually changes over time. This would be pointing to things that would be changing in that video, so unfortunately that doesn't work. But when we think about these mangrove ecosystems, and hopefully you all have had an opportunity to visit and walk through this tangled mess of roots. Here, this is in the Gabon estuary, but right, this really dense mat of roots that are holding on to those soils in these coastal regions. And so, when we look at something like this here in the Ganges Brahmaputra, right, this is the north end of the Sundarbans mangrove forest, right? These locations are extremely valuable, not only for those habitats, right, but thinking about this is where communities live, this is where our rice, our shrimp essentially come from. And so a lot of these places are valuable beyond that, right? Whoops. And so in some places, this is in the Rufiji Delta in Tanzania. Some places are being deforested. In the case here, girdled, slash and burn. Eventually this turns into either a rice paddy or a salt farm. And so when we think about how are these ecosystems changing, we want to be able to define, is it something that's changing like this, an anthropogenic event that's devastating to the environment? Or is it something that is more naturally driven, something that's, in the case here, this is for South Florida, but this is 2 or 3 years after Hurricane Irma passed through in 2017, right? So here you're still keeping a lot of the structure, a lot of the essentially biomass is kind of still there and holding on to the soils, right? So we really wanted to understand how we define and measure these different changes in these ecosystems across the world. And here's another example of in that spot where you've had cyclone damage, where you've impounded water, the conditions aren't right for those mangroves to survive. This is what happens. This is now 5-6 years after Hurricane Irma passed, right? And so this is, again, one of those things that we really wanted to try to identify, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And so a few years ago, we did publish on this. We used, millions of satellite images from the Landsat archive to look at mangrove change globally. And so what we were able to define here is not just identifying where mangroves were being lost or how fast they were being lost, but really what was the end result? What were essentially the reasons or those drivers, those proximate drivers of that loss? And here's just some examples as we go from Indonesia to Bangladesh to Myanmar of that transition on the left, where you have more agriculture and aquaculture, shrimp and rice farms. In the middle, where you have more shoreline erosion. And on the right here, again, more agriculture, more rice, rice paddies here. And so all of these have a sort of a different impact to the way the carbon cycle works. How much soil is being lost, how disturbed the vegetation or those soils are, right? And so this is one thing that we were trying to map globally. And so we did that, and we found that, a variety of these natural, human, and also combined factors play a role in that mangrove loss. So we were really focused on shoreline erosion, that conversion to commodities, the role of extreme weather events. So this kind of included droughts and cyclones, this non-productive conversion category. So think of this as changes in hydrology driven by roads or dams or levees that are being built. And then on the bottom there, in the Mekong, just this example of coastal squeeze, right? Where you have deforestation that's happening in the hinterland, and then shoreline erosion that's happening along the coast. And so when we put all of this together, we found out that about 60% of the mangrove losses in the 21st century were driven by humans, primarily the conversion to commodities, but also a little bit from non-productive conversion. And so here we've just kind of aggregated it at the continental scale. Again, where you see Asia, again, this is where the largest distribution of mangroves are, primarily driven by that conversion to commodities. A lot of that in delta systems. And so here on the bottom, right, about 1,100 square kilometers, or about 20% of those losses occurred in delta ecosystems or delta systems. And so what does this mean when we think about then how did we lose that mangrove forest, right? Was it cut? Was it eroded? That all went into a model here working with some colleagues, Fernanda and others, where we tried to understand, well, what is that future carbon emission because of that type of loss? And so thinking about what Andre was kind of showing earlier, when we consider carbon sequestration, when we consider carbon stocks, we were able to sort of put some emissions numbers on that. And here you're kind of seeing this distribution of those different drivers. Each of those polygons is essentially a bioclimate. And then looking at the potential CO2 emissions at the end of the century. And so in the end, these 6 regions accounted for about 90% of the total of those potential CO2 emissions. A lot of that driven by the Caribbean, as well as sort of South and Southeast Asia. And so we wanted to take this step back a little bit as well and see, we know how much is lost since the 21st century, but we really wanted to get an idea of numbers have been thrown around. About 50% of mangrove forests have been lost around the world. And so we took this a little step backwards. This has been published. Needs to be updated. But we did some work taking the Landsat satellite record back to the 1970s. And so here we did a study looking at Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia, and looking at that loss over the last essentially 50 plus years. And you can see here about, over 8,000 square kilometers of mangroves were lost in just these 3 countries. The majority of that happening in these 3 delta regions, right? And so we see this dramatic loss happening between the early 1970s and the mid 1990s, right? So this dramatic change in the extent of mangrove forests in these regions, and it tells you a little bit about, again, how that amount of carbon is changing across those regions. So when we consider all of those losses that we've measured from 2000 onward, wrong slide here. So thinking about what Andre actually presented earlier, and Andre, you used another data set that was out there at the time, but our number lines up very closely with what you had, right? So about 40% of the mangrove forests globally are in 84 river deltas, essentially about twice as much as any other coastal region. And so these deltas are extremely important in sort of having the sort of largest remaining intact tracts of mangrove forest in the world. And there's only and the deltaic regions have essentially the 18 largest contiguous mangrove units. So this is some work that we did back in 2020, where we sort of identified that distribution of mangrove forest into different geomorphologies. And again, the 3 largest units contain about 12% of those mangroves, that being the Niger Delta, the deltaic coast of Brazil, and the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta. So in that study, we essentially separated the world into, oh, wow, that's fast. Okay. So ultimately, we looked at hotspots. This is some work with Mark Simard, where we've updated this data set, and we're looking at those rates of change. And what we're seeing is declines within commodities, but we are seeing an increase in the expansion of mangrove forests. Thank you.